He saved her life, but her billionaire father called him a disposable janitor and tried to destroy him. She was told to stand down and fire the hero. Hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this story. We're always interested to see where our audience is joining from, so please feel free to let us know which city or country you're watching from and the current time there in the comments below. If you appreciate compelling narratives like this one, and you wish to see how she masterfully turns the tables on her father, we would be grateful if you would like the video and subscribe to our channel for more to come. The city of Chicago was a tapestry of light woven into the dark fabric of the night, a sight that cost millions and was framed perfectly by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blair Davenport's office. From 80 stories up, the world was an abstraction, silent, beautiful, and distant. Just the way she liked it. The office itself was an extension of her will, black marble floors, sharp chrome angles, and a single perfect orchid on her vast obsidian desk. It was less a workspace and more a mausoleum for emotion. At 28, Blair was the CEO of Apex Aeronautics, a position she hadn't just inherited but had seized, transforming her father's legacy into a global powerhouse. She exuded an aura of control so absolute it felt like a physical force. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant knot, not a single strand out of place. Her gaze, fixed on the holographic display hovering over her desk, was as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. Her fingers danced across a keyboard, the soft clicks the only sound in the cavernous room. On the screen was a draft email, its recipient a logistics vendor who had missed a critical deadline by 3 hours. To R. Miller, CEO, Skylink Logistics subject. Contract termination. Mr. Miller. This email serves as official notification of the immediate termination of our contract, pursuant to Section 4B of our agreement regarding performance standards. Apex Aeronautics does not accommodate mediocrity. All assets are to be retrieved from our facilities within 24 hours. Regards, Blair Davenport, CEO, Apex Aeronautics. She read it twice, her expression unreadable. The words were a guillotine, clean and final. There was no room for negotiation, no space for excuses. She hit send. The display vanished, plunging the room back into near darkness, lit only by the distant, indifferent city. For a fleeting moment the mask slipped. Her shoulders slumped by a fraction of an inch, and she pressed her fingertips to her temples. Weakness is a liability, she thought, the words a familiar, bitter mantra. The voice in her head sounded like her ex-fiancé Richard on the day he'd left. I can't be Mr. Davenport, he'd said, his ambition curdling into resentment the moment her name went on the CEO's door. I won't live in your shadow. The betrayal had been a vital lesson. She'd learned that affection was a vulnerability and trust was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. So she built walls of chrome and glass and success, creating a fortress so high no one could ever reach her. A gilded cage where she was queen, and she was the sole prisoner. 75 floors below, in the quiet hum of the building's maintenance wing, a different world existed. The air here smelled of industrial solvent, ozone, and faintly of crayons. This was the sanctuary of Cade Nolan. At 33, his face was etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and a past he never discussed. Dressed in the simple gray uniform of the Apex maintenance crew, he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed out of place among the humming machinery and polished concrete floors. He was wiping down a diagnostic console, his movements economical and precise, each swipe of the cloth leaving a perfect, streak-free shine. He was invisible by design. The executives who strode through these halls saw the uniform, not the man. They didn't see the disciplined set of his shoulders, a relic of a life spent in body armor, or the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, assessing, cataloging, a habit forged in places where the shadows held more than just dust. They saw a janitor, and that's all he wanted them to see. A soft sigh from the corner of the room drew his attention. In a small, repurposed storage closet, a makeshift bedroom had been created. A worn camping cot was neatly made, and tucked under a thick wool blanket was his daughter, Zoe. At 6 years old, she was the anchor of his universe, the bright, warm center of his collapsed galaxy. Her blonde hair fanned out on the pillow, and her small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. Beside the cot was a small, overturned crate serving as a nightstand. On it sat a glass of water and Zoe's most prized possession, a sketchbook with a worn blue cover. Cade picked it up, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle. He smiled as he flipped through the pages. They were filled with fantastical flying machines. Helicopters with butterfly wings, jets with dragon heads, and rocket ships that looked like soaring eagles. On the last page was a detailed, surprisingly accurate drawing of the company's flagship helicopter, the Apex Valkyrie, which sat on the helipad 80 floors above. Below it, in a child's wobbly script, was written, "My dad's office." He gently placed the book back, his heart aching with a familiar mix of love and sorrow. He was doing this for her. This life of anonymity, of mopping floors and fixing wiring in the ghost hours of the night, was the penance he paid for a past that was too dangerous to remember. He had flown through storms of fire and steel, but the quiet grief of losing his wife had been the one thing that had permanently grounded him. He'd walked away from the sky, from the roar of engines and the brotherhood of the uniform, to give Zoe something he never had, a life of peace. He tucked the blanket more securely around her shoulder, his touch a silent promise. "I'll keep you safe." He stepped out of the closet, the quiet hum of the building his only companion. Above him, Blair Davenport stood alone in her kingdom of glass and steel. Down here, Cade Nolan stood guard over his tiny, precious world. They were two solitary souls at opposite ends of the same building, separated by a vertical mile of ambition and tragedy, completely unaware that a single spark was about to send their separate worlds crashing together. The first sign of trouble was subtle, an almost imperceptible scent on the recycled air of the 80th floor. A smell like burnt plastic and ozone, sharp and out of place in Blair's sterile environment. She dismissed it as a glitch in the ventilation, her focus narrowed on a quarterly earnings report. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. They held for a moment, buzzing with a sickly yellow hue, before dying completely. Blair was plunged into an absolute, disorienting darkness. For a half-second she felt nothing but annoyance. A power outage in a building designed to be a self-sustaining fortress? Unacceptable. She reached for her phone, its screen a blinding beacon. No signal. A cold knot began to tighten in her stomach. That's when the second sound came, a deafening percussive clang that echoed through the floor. It was the sound of the emergency lockdown shutters, thick slabs of reinforced steel, slamming down over the windows and sealing the floor into a tomb. The building's emergency systems, the ones she had personally signed off on, the ones touted as infallible, were failing catastrophically. The backup generators hadn't kicked in. The communication lines were dead. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her armor of control. A thin, gray tendril of smoke curled lazily under her office door. Life can throw chaos at you when you least expect it, and a system you trust can fail you completely. Smash that like button if you believe good people deserve to catch a break. Only those who root for disaster would scroll past. Down on the 5th floor, Cade Nolan was cleaning a spill when the scent hit him. It wasn't just burnt plastic, it was the specific acrid smell of an electrical fire, a scent he knew from burning Humvees and downed aircraft. His body reacted before his mind had time to process. There was no panic, only a switch being flipped. The janitor vanished and the night stalker took his place. He moved with a fluid economy of motion. He strode to the storage closet, his steps silent and urgent. "Zoe," he said, his voice low but firm, not a whisper that would scare her, but a command that would wake her. "Time to go, sweet pea. Game time." Zoe's eyes fluttered open, sleepy and confused. He didn't wait for questions. He scooped her up, her small body still warm with sleep, and grabbed the heavy-duty fire extinguisher from its wall mount. One-handed, he cracked the hallway door. It was hazy, the air thick with the taste of chemicals. His training took over. Assess, orient, act. The elevators were dead. The primary stairwells would be chimneys for the smoke. That left the north maintenance stairs, less direct but more likely to be clear. He found Blair on the 80th floor, silhouetted against the faint orange glow coming from the far end of the hall. She was pulling uselessly at the handle of a sealed stairwell door, her composure beginning to fray. "Ma'am?" Cade's voice cut through the haze. It wasn't the quiet, respectful tone of her maintenance tech. It was a bark of command, sharp and absolute, a voice that expected to be obeyed without question. Blair spun around, startled. She saw the silhouette of a man holding a child and a fire extinguisher. "Nolan. This way. Now." He didn't wait for her to agree. He was already moving, his body low to the ground. Stay below the smoke. Every instinct in Blair's body screamed at her to resist, to take charge. But her authority was useless here. Her CO title couldn't stop the fire, her wealth couldn't buy an exit. The man in the janitor's uniform was the only one with a plan. Swallowing her pride, a bitter pill, she dropped into a crouch and followed him. The journey upward was a Dantean nightmare. Cade led them to the maintenance stairwell, a narrow, steel-enclosed passage that was already heating like an oven. He kicked the door open and was met with a gust of hot, smoky air. "Hold your breath," he commanded. He moved first, shielding Zoe with his body, her face buried in his shoulder. Blair followed, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. The steel handrail was hot to the touch. The only light was the intermittent, strobing flash of a failing emergency beacon on each landing, illuminating the swirling smoke in hellish, frozen moments. Zoe started to cough, a dry, ragged sound that tore at Cade's heart. He didn't slow down. "Almost there, sweet pea. Just a little longer. You're doing great," he murmured to her, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos, a stark contrast to the sharp commands he issued to Blair. "Faster, Miss Davenport. Don't stop." Blair's legs ached, her lungs felt like they were full of gravel. She watched the man in front of her, his movements never faltering. He carried his daughter as if she weighed nothing, wielding the heavy extinguisher with an easy familiarity. There was a confidence in his posture, a certainty in his voice that was completely at odds with the man she'd seen quietly mopping her floors. This wasn't a janitor. This was something else entirely. She was relying on him, trusting him, and the realization was as dizzying as the smoke. After an eternity, he stopped at a final door, a heavy steel plate with a wheel for a handle. "The roof," he grunted, putting his shoulder into it. With a groan of protesting metal, the door swung open and they stumbled out into the night. The chaos of the stairwell was replaced by the roaring symphony of the wind and the fire. The frigid Chicago air was a shock to their scorched lungs. They were on the helipad 80 stories above the street, on a tiny windswept island in a sea of fire. Below them, the top floors of the apex tower were beginning to glow, an angry, malevolent orange. The city's sirens were a faint, distant chorus. In the center of the helipad, gleaming under the strobing emergency lights, sat the Apex Valkyrie, a silent, multi-million-dollar machine. It was their only way out. An impossible escape sitting right in front of them. The flight was a symphony of controlled chaos. Blair remembered the terrifying lurch as the Apex Valkyrie lifted off the burning roof, the city spinning below them in a sickening vortex of light and smoke. She remembered the roar of the engines warring with the howl of the wind, and through it all, the impossible calm of the man in the pilot's seat. Cade Nolan didn't fly the helicopter. He commanded it, his hands moving over the controls with an innate, fluid mastery that defied his janitor's uniform. He navigated the treacherous urban canyons between skyscrapers as if they were old, familiar territory, his focus absolute. The landing was jarring, a sudden descent into the damp, manicured lawns of Lincoln Park. The moment the skids touched the grass, the roar of the rotors began to wind down, replaced by a new cacophony, the approaching wail of sirens. The world rushed in. Paramedics, firefighters, and police swarmed the helicopter. A door was pulled open and the cold, damp air flooded the cabin. A paramedic wrapped a coarse, gray blanket around Blair's shoulders, speaking to her in a calm, professional voice she couldn't quite process. Her ears were ringing. Her mind was a slideshow of fractured images. The fire, the smoke, the terrifying drop from the roof. She was assessed, checked for injuries, and pronounced fine, but the words were just noise. Her gaze was fixed across the small, chaotic scene. Cade had brushed off the paramedics attending to him. He was on one knee in the wet grass, his entire world narrowed to the small, trembling figure of his daughter. He had already wrapped his own thick maintenance jacket around Zoe's shoulders, the gray fabric dwarfing her. He was murmuring to her, his voice too low to hear, but his expression was one of such profound, gentle reassurance that it made Blair's breath catch in her throat. He wasn't a hero celebrating a victory. He was just a father, shielding his child from the frightening aftermath. He wiped a smudge of soot from Zoe's cheek with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. In that moment, the man she had seen for months, the quiet, invisible maintenance worker, and the man who had just saved her life, the decisive commander, the master pilot, merged into a single incomprehensible person. She knew his name, his job title, and the fact that he had a daughter. And that was it. She knew nothing, and yet she owed him everything. The thought was a jolt of ice in her veins. A debt. She understood debt. It was a figure on a balance sheet, a contractual obligation, a transaction to be settled. But this was different. This was a debt of existence. He hadn't just saved her company, he had saved her. It was an absolute, unquantifiable obligation that tied her to him in a way she couldn't control or sever. It was a connection forged in fire and fear, and to a woman who had built her entire life on emotional detachment, it was terrifying. The sharp, authoritative voice of her father cut through her daze. Blair. Thank God. Preston Davenport strode onto the scene as if he were stepping onto a yacht. Dressed in a perfectly tailored cashmere overcoat, he parted the crowd of first responders with sheer force of will. He enveloped Blair in a brief, stiff hug that smelled of expensive cologne and power. Are you all right? I came as soon as I heard. I'm fine, Father, she managed, her voice hoarse. Preston's eyes scanned the scene, quickly assessing the situation. They landed on Cade, who was now helping Zoe take a sip of water from a bottle a firefighter had given them. Preston's expression of fatherly concern tightened into one of cool appraisal. He walked over, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft turf. You must be the man of the hour, Preston said, his voice smooth but lacking any real warmth. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply looked Cade up and down, a flicker of dismissive surprise in his eyes that a man in such a uniform could perform such an act. Cade, holding Zoe close, simply met his gaze and nodded. Just doing what was necessary, sir. Indeed, Preston replied, the word clipped. He gave a curt, condescending nod. Well done. The family is in your debt. It was the kind of platitude one offers to a doorman for holding a door in the rain. It was a dismissal, a final pat on the head to the hired help before turning back to more important matters. He turned his back on Cade and guided Blair toward a waiting black car. Blair glanced back, her jaw tight. She saw the condescension in her father's posture, the clear, unspoken message that Cade's heroism was a temporary, shocking aberration from his station in life. And she saw the quiet dignity in Cade's stance as he watched them go, his arm wrapped protectively around his daughter. The debt she felt toward Cade suddenly had a new, sharp edge, a fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. 3 days after the fire, the smell of smoke still lingered in Blair's hair, a constant, phantom reminder of her own mortality. Apex Aeronautics was operating out of a soulless temporary office space downtown, a chaotic maze of rented desks and hastily connected servers. The media storm had been relentless, painting the story as a modern fairy tale, the billionaire CEO saved by the heroic janitor. Blair hated it. The narrative stripped her of her agency and turned Cade into a caricature. The reality was far more complicated, and the business fallout was just beginning. The ultimatum came during a tense video conference with the board of Omnicore Dynamics. A silver-haired man named Coleman, their chairman, didn't mince words. Blair, we admire your resilience, he began, his voice a low, corporate purr. However, the fire has created a significant perceived risk. Our stakeholders are nervous. The merger's viability now hinges on a tangible demonstration of Apex's operational stability. The message was clear, wrapped in a velvet glove but delivered like a steel fist. They wanted a public flight demonstration of the Valkyrie, piloted by an Apex professional, to prove that the company hadn't gone up in smoke with the building. Their chief pilot, a man named Henderson, was in the hospital with 2 broken ribs and smoke inhalation from the fire. There was only one other person on the planet she knew could fly that machine with the required level of flawless precision. The moral calculus of what she had to do was agonizing. It felt like a violation. Cade Nolan had saved her life, and now she had to ask him to face the very demons that had driven him from the sky, all for the sake of her company's stock price. She tried to frame it as a transaction, a repayment of her debt. She would offer him a life he and Zoe could only dream of, a pilot's salary, a secure future, the best schools. It was a golden opportunity. But she couldn't silence the voice in her head that called it what it was: exploitation. She found him in a small, windowless break room, carefully cleaning a coffee machine. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes darker than before. Nolan. Cade, she began, the name feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. I have a proposal for you. He turned, his expression neutral, guarded. "Ma'am?" Blair laid it out, her voice crisp and professional, devoid of the emotional turmoil churning within her. She spoke of the Omnicore merger, the need for a pilot, and the position she was creating, chief demonstration pilot for Apex Aeronautics. She detailed the six-figure salary, the signing bonus, the comprehensive benefits package, the relocation assistance. It was a king's ransom, a golden ladder out of his current life. Cade listened without interruption, his gaze steady. She couldn't read his expression. Was it temptation? Resentment? Nothing? When she finished, the silence stretched, thick with unspoken weight. Before he could utter a single word, a sharp, imperious voice cut through the air. "Absolutely not." Preston Davenport stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold disapproval. He had been lurking, listening. He strode into the room, completely ignoring Cade as if he were a piece of furniture, and addressed Blair directly. "Have you lost your mind? Putting the reputation of this entire company on the shoulders of a maintenance worker? Father, this isn't the time." "This is precisely the time," he snapped, his voice low and venomous. "I've made inquiries about this man. A decorated past, yes, but one that ended in a discharge for psychological distress. He's a tragic figure, Blair. A charity case you seem determined to turn into a mascot. Preston Davenport thinks a person's job title defines their worth. Hit subscribe if you know that character and courage are what truly matter. People who agree with Preston's elitist attitude won't bother." He finally turned his gaze on Cade, a dismissive, withering look. "I commend you for your actions during the fire, Nolan. You were brave. But your station is here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the coffee machine. "Flying the Valkyrie for the Omnicore board is a task for a professional, not a handyman with a lucky past. The Davenport name, the Apex brand, will not be represented by a janitor." The arrogance was suffocating, a toxic cloud of privilege and scorn. He spoke as if Cade wasn't even there, reducing a man of immense skill and courage to nothing more than a social status. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, deciding who was and wasn't worthy based on a pay grade. We all know someone who looks down on others because of their position in life. If you can't stand the arrogance of characters like Preston, comment, "Respect is earned," down below. Let's show that we value people, not price tags. A cold fury, sharp and unfamiliar, ignited in Blair's chest. For years she had respected her father's ruthless business acumen, mistaking it for strength. Now she saw it for what it was, a brittle, ugly cruelty. She saw the man who had saved her, the father who had protected his child, being verbally dissected by a man who wouldn't know the meaning of the word sacrifice if it was stamped on a gold bar. She opened her mouth to speak, to unleash a torrent of rage, but Cade moved first. He simply looked at Preston, his expression still unreadable but for a flicker of something hard and ancient in his eyes. He then turned his gaze to Blair. "I'll think about your offer, Ms. Davenport," he said, his voice perfectly even. Then, with a quiet dignity that was 1,000 times more powerful than Preston's blustering rage, he walked out of the room, leaving Blair alone with the suffocating presence of her father. The air in the break room was still thick with the residue of Preston's arrogance. After he was gone, Blair looked at Cade, expecting to see anger or at the very least resentment. Instead, his expression was one of profound weariness, the look of a man who had been fighting battles far more significant than this for a very long time. "Your father doesn't see people, Ms. Davenport," Cade said, his voice quiet but clear. "He sees assets and liabilities." He paused, his gaze meeting hers directly. "I'll consider your offer. But I have one condition. I need an hour in the flight simulator. Alone." It wasn't a request. It was a term of engagement. He wasn't asking for practice. He was asking for a reckoning with himself. "Done," Blair said without hesitation, a spark of defiance against her father solidifying her resolve. "The bay is yours tonight. All logs will be wiped." That evening, Blair stood in the darkened observation room overlooking the Apex simulation bay. It was a cathedral of technology, and at its center sat the simulator, a gleaming white pod mounted on a complex gyroscopic rig, capable of replicating any flight condition with terrifying accuracy. Through the one-way glass, she watched Cade enter the cockpit. He moved with a familiar grace, but his shoulders were tight, his posture rigid. This wasn't a hero returning to his element. It was a man walking into a cage where his demons lived. The simulation began. The panoramic screens inside the cockpit flickered to life, displaying a photorealistic Chicago skyline on a clear, calm day. From her monitor, Blair saw Cade's hands move over the controls, a dance of muscle memory. He ran through the pre-flight diagnostics, his voice a low, steady murmur as he called out checks to an imaginary co-pilot. He lifted the simulated Valkyrie off the virtual helipad, the movement so smooth it was like watching a surgeon make an incision. For 20 minutes he was perfect. He performed graceful banking turns over Lake Michigan and hovered motionless over the river. Blair felt a surge of relief. He could do this. Her father was wrong. Then the parameters changed. The calm blue sky dissolved, replaced by the harsh, sun-bleached landscape of a desert canyon at dusk. The default combat setting. The calm radio chatter vanished, supplanted by the crackle of urgent, coded transmissions. Red icons began to pop up on the tactical display, enemy positions. Cade's posture shifted. He was no longer just flying. He was hunting, his eyes scanning the horizon, his body tensing with a coiled energy. The simulation threw everything at him. Surface-to-air missile warnings, RPG fire from the canyon ridges, a sudden sandstorm that reduced visibility to near zero. He handled it all with a chilling, almost supernatural competence. He dodged, he weaved, he flew the aircraft in ways Blair didn't think were physically possible. But the simulation wasn't just testing his skill. It was testing his soul. A panicked voice erupted over the comms, a voice that was just a digital echo but felt terrifyingly real. Mayday, mayday. This is Nomad 2. We're hit. RPG to the tail rotor. We're going down. On the screen, Blair saw a second friendly helicopter icon spiral out of control and crash behind a ridge. Cade's breathing became ragged. His knuckles were white on the controls. The objective of his mission flashed on the screen. Extract VIP. Do not engage. The comms crackled again, the voice now desperate, laced with static and fear. Cade. It's Jax. We're down but we're alive. They're closing in. You gotta come back for us. Cade, do you copy? And then Blair saw it. The first plot twist wasn't just a story she was told, it was a memory she was witnessing. Cade wasn't in a simulator anymore. His eyes were wide, unfocused, seeing a different desert, a different night, 3 years ago. The sweat beating on his forehead was real. The tremor in his hands was real. This was his last mission. He hadn't just been a pilot. He had been the flight lead, the commander. Nomad 1. He had a high-value government asset on board. His orders were absolute. Cade, don't leave us here. The voice screamed from the speakers, the simulated voice of his best friend Jax. I can't, Jax. The package, orders are. Cade choked out the words to the empty cockpit, his voice strangled. You're the commander. You make the call. Blair watched, frozen in horror, as Cade's face contorted in a mask of pure agony. He was reliving the impossible choice. His duty versus his brother in arms. He banked the helicopter away from the crash site, following his orders, securing the mission. He got a medal for it. And Jax was captured. The simulation, sensing his deviation from the rescue path, ended the program. But for Cade it was still happening. The screens went blank, the sounds cut out, but he was still there, in the suffocating silence of his failure. A raw, guttural cry was torn from his throat, a sound of such profound loss and self-loathing that it made Blair flinch. He slammed his fists against the console. I'm sorry, he screamed, the sound echoing in the silent, empty cockpit. Jax, I'm sorry. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, his body racked with deep, silent sobs. Blair stood in the darkness of the observation room, her hand pressed against the cold glass, tears streaming down her own face. The hero who had been so unshakable, so in command, was a man carrying a wound so deep it had never healed. He hadn't just lost his wife. He believed he had failed his best friend, and he had been living in that prison ever since. Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Judging someone's present without understanding their past is Preston Davenport's specialty. Share this story if you believe in giving people grace. Only the heartless would refuse. She now understood. The flight demonstration wasn't just a job for him. It was a trial. And she had just witnessed him being sentenced all over again. The morning after the simulator incident, the Chicago sunlight felt harsh and intrusive. Blair sat in her temporary office, the Omnicorps contract on her desk, but her mind was a million miles away, trapped in the suffocating silence of a cockpit with a broken man. The image of Cade's raw agony was seared into her memory. The merger, the money, the legacy, it all felt like dust compared to the weight of the secret she now carried, the profound and painful understanding of what she was asking him to do. She hadn't heard from him since he'd left the simulation bay, and a heavy sense of dread had settled over her. The door to her office was thrown open without a knock, slamming against the wall with a crack that made her jolt. Preston Davenport stood there, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. His usual mask of paternal concern had been discarded, revealing the cold, predatory ambition beneath. In his hand he held a tablet, its screen glowing ominously. "I was hoping my source was exaggerating," he began, his voice dangerously low as he strode to her desk and slapped the tablet down. "But the logs don't lie. A full psychotic episode in our most advanced piece of hardware." On the screen was a detailed report from the simulation, time-stamped and clinically detailing a pilot experiencing extreme psychological distress, vocalizations of duress, and a catastrophic failure to adhere to mission parameters. It was a complete, cold-blooded misrepresentation of what she had witnessed. It was his spy's report. "He is a broken soldier, Blair. A liability," Preston seethed, the words striking like vipers. "You saw it with your own eyes. This isn't a hero you're championing, he's a ticking time bomb. What happens when it's not a simulation? What happens when he has the Omnicorps executives in that helicopter and one of his ghosts decides to show up? You would be risking not just the merger but their lives. You would be destroying this company, this family, all out of some misguided sense of gratitude." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a grotesque pantomime of concern. "Think of your reputation. The board already has its doubts after the fire. If they find out you knowingly put an unstable pilot in control of our flagship aircraft, you'll be finished." Blair stared at him, her dread hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He wasn't concerned for the company or for her. He was seizing an opportunity, using Cade's deepest trauma as a weapon to reassert his control. "What do you want, Father?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Preston straightened up, his expression shifting to one of cold finality. He had reached his endgame. "You will terminate his employment. Immediately. Citing the results of his evaluation in the simulator. Give him a generous severance package, make him sign an NDA. Erase him. Then we will inform Omnicorps that our chief pilot is still medically unfit and postpone the demonstration." It was a brutal, clean, and utterly soulless solution. Treat a human being like a failed project to be shelved and forgotten. Blair looked from the tablet, with its clinical, cruel lies, to her father's unyielding face. She thought of Cade shielding Zoe from the smoke, of his quiet dignity in the face of her father's scorn, of the raw, agonizing cry she had heard in the dark. The choice was instantaneous. It wasn't even a choice. "No," she said. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Preston's eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" "I said no," Blair repeated, standing up to meet his gaze, her voice steady and clear. "I will not fire a man for being human. I will not punish him for a wound he received while serving his country. He will fly that demonstration and I will stand by him." For a moment, Preston looked genuinely shocked. Then the shock melted away, replaced by a slow, cold, triumphant smile. It was the look of a predator who had just cornered its prey exactly where it wanted. This was the reaction he had anticipated, the one he had planned for. "A shame," he said softly, his voice dripping with false pity. "I had hoped you would be reasonable." As he spoke, Blair's phone, sitting on the desk beside her, buzzed. She glanced down. A calendar notification had just appeared on her screen. Her blood ran cold as she read the words. Event, Emergency Apex Board Meeting. Organizer, Preston Davenport. Subject, Urgent Review of CEO's Executive Decisions and Associated High-Risk Personnel. Time, Friday 10 a.m. It was the exact day, the exact hour of the scheduled Omnicorps demonstration flight. She looked up at her father. He was still smiling. He had boxed her in completely. She could be on the ground in the boardroom, fighting for her job while her pilot was condemned in absentia. Or she could be at the airfield, supporting her pilot while her father systematically dismantled her career and had her removed from the company she had built. She had been checkmated. For a long moment after Preston left, Blair stood in the suffocating silence of her office, the calendar notification glowing on her phone like a miniature tombstone. Checkmated. The thought was a cold, slick thing, the kind of tactical defeat she was used to inflicting, not receiving. A wave of icy despair washed over her, followed by something else entirely, a white-hot surge of pure, unadulterated rage. Her father had mistaken her compassion for weakness. He had mistaken Cade's quiet dignity for fragility. They were both about to learn how wrong he was. Instead of calling her lawyers or collapsing in defeat, Blair made one call. 5 minutes later, she was standing in the small, sterile break room where her father had delivered his verdict. Cade was there, packing a small bag for Zoe, his movements calm and resigned. He looked up as she entered, expecting to be told he was fired. "He gave me an ultimatum," Blair said, her voice devoid of any preamble. She didn't hide a single detail. She told him about the emergency board meeting, the subject, the timing. She told him how her father had twisted the events in the simulator into a weapon. She laid the entire, ugly checkmate on the table between them. "He's engineered it so I can't be in two places at once. He wants me to choose between saving my company and defending you. He expects me to cut you loose." Cade listened, his expression unreadable. "You should," he said finally, his voice flat. "It's the smart play. I'm not your problem." "The hell you're not," Blair shot back, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised them both. "My father is the problem. His arrogance, his bigotry, that's the liability. You are the asset. He cornered me, so I'm going to do what he never expected. I'm not choosing. I'm fighting. But I can't win this war on my own." She took a step closer. "I need a partner. Are you in?" Cade stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw a woman who was terrified but resolute, a CEO willing to burn down her own kingdom for a principle. For him. For years he had trusted no one, believing he was the sole protector of his small world. In that moment he realized he wasn't alone anymore. A slow, determined nod was his answer. "I'm in." That single word ignited a flurry of controlled, focused activity. They were no longer CEO and employee, they were co-conspirators preparing for a two-front war. Blair's front was the boardroom. She transformed her office into a war room. She made a call to a close friend, a 3-star general at the Pentagon, calling in a favor she had been saving for years. Within hours, a secure digital file arrived. It was Cade's entire unabridged military record. As they scrolled through it together late into the night, a portrait of unparalleled heroism emerged. The Distinguished Flying Cross. The Silver Star. And then they found it. The complete, unredacted after-action report for Operation Nomad Sky. It contained eyewitness testimony from the men on Cade's helicopter. It detailed the impossible tactical situation, the overwhelming enemy numbers, and the absolute certainty that turning back for Jax's downed aircraft would have resulted in the loss of both helicopters and the high-value asset. The final page was a signed commendation from his commanding general. It read, "Captain Nolan's decision, while personally devastating, was the only command decision possible. It was an act of tactical brilliance and extraordinary discipline under unimaginable pressure. It wasn't a failure, it was a sacrifice." This was Blair's ammunition. Cade's front was the sky. The next day he was back in the simulator, but this time was different. Blair sat in the co-pilot's seat, not as a witness but as his support. He ran the combat scenario again, and when Jax's frantic voice filled the cockpit, Cade's hands remained steady. He flew the mission as ordered, his face a mask of stone. He wasn't burying the ghost, he was acknowledging it, honoring the sacrifice and flying through the pain. Afterwards he spent hours with the Apex engineering team, personally inspecting every inch of the Valkyrie, his focus absolute. He was no longer a man haunted by a machine. He was a master reclaiming his craft. They worked in a seamless, unspoken partnership. She brought him coffee as he reviewed telemetry data. He pointed out a key tactical detail in his report that she could use to dismantle her father's arguments. The formal Ms. Davenport and Nolan had vanished, replaced by a simple Blair and Cade. They were a team, united by a common enemy and a shared, defiant hope. As the sun rose on the morning of the demonstration, they stood together, looking out over the city. The board meeting and the flight were hours away. They were ready. The morning broke over Chicago, cold, clear, and pregnant with tension. Two battles were set to begin at precisely 10 a.m. At a private airfield just outside the city, the Apex Valkyrie gleamed under the morning sun, its rotors still. The Omnicore executives, including their CEO Coleman, stood by, their expressions a mixture of nervous anticipation and corporate skepticism. Cade Nolan walked toward them, not in a maintenance uniform, but in a professional Apex flight suit that fit him like a second skin. He moved with an aura of quiet confidence that was deeply reassuring. He shook Coleman's hand, his grip firm. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice calm and steady. As they boarded, he caught Blair's eye one last time across the tarmac. She gave him a single, resolute nod. "Fly safe." Simultaneously, in the hushed, mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 35th floor of a downtown skyscraper, Blair Davenport took her seat at the head of the long table. The air was thick with hostility. The board members, a jury of stone-faced men and women in their 60s, avoided her gaze. Her father, Preston Davenport, sat opposite her, looking smug and composed. He held a leather-bound folder containing his prepared remarks, the final nail for his daughter's coffin. The meeting began. Preston didn't wait. He rose, his voice resonating with feigned gravitas. "Members of the board," he began, "we are here today to address a grave matter of leadership and liability. My daughter, in a commendable but dangerously emotional response to the recent fire, has placed this company's future in the hands of a man who is, to put it plainly, a risk we cannot afford." Cut to the sky. The Valkyrie lifted off, a symphony of power and grace. Cade's hands were a blur on the controls, his movements precise and economical. For 15 minutes, the demonstration was flawless. He showcased the helicopter's agility, its speed, its whisper-quiet hover capabilities. Below them, Lake Michigan was a vast, glittering expanse of blue. The Omnicore executives were visibly impressed, their tense postures relaxing into smiles. Coleman leaned forward, speaking into his headset over the hum of the rotors. "Impressive, Mr. Nolan. Truly impressive." Back in the boardroom, Preston was hitting his stride. He projected the falsified simulator report onto the main screen, the words psychological distress and catastrophic failure glowing in sharp relief. "This is not an opinion," he said, his voice dripping with condescending certainty. "This is data. The man is a decorated hero, and for that we salute him. But his service left him wounded, and his breakdown in our own simulator is proof that he is a ticking time bomb. Blair's insistence on using him is not a calculated risk. It is an emotional gamble with our entire portfolio." He let the words hang in the air, the accusation of feminine, emotional leadership a clear, sexist undertone. The board members shifted uncomfortably. He was winning. It was then that Blair made her move. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply picked up a remote. "You're right, Father," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Data is everything. So let's look at some." With a click, the simulator report vanished, replaced by a multi-panel, high-definition live feed. The cockpit of the Valkyrie, a cabin view of the executives, and a stunning panoramic shot from a nose-mounted camera. In the air, the world changed in a heartbeat. The clear blue sky vanished, swallowed by a sudden violent wall of dark gray cloud. A microburst, a freak, localized weather event, slammed into the Valkyrie with the force of a battering ram. The aircraft dropped 100 feet in a single, gut-wrenching second. Inside the cabin, the executives were thrown against their harnesses. Alarms blared, a chaotic symphony of electronic screams. "What was that?" Coleman yelled, his face pale with terror. A new, more urgent alarm shrieked through the cockpit. A red light flashed on the console. Tail rotor malfunction. The helicopter began to yaw violently, swinging sideways like a pendulum. They were losing control. But while the executives panicked, Cade became a pillar of preternatural calm. The janitor, the hero, the broken soldier, they all fell away, leaving only the Night Stalker. His eyes, narrowed in concentration, scanned the instruments. His voice cut through the alarms, calm and commanding. "This is the pilot. We've hit a severe downdraft and sustained damage to the tail rotor. Do not panic. I have control." His hands flew across the console, overriding the failing automated systems. "Fighting the yaw," he murmured, his feet dancing on the anti-torque pedals, manually compensating for the loss of the tail rotor. "Maintaining forward airspeed to counteract spin." He wasn't just flying, he was wrestling a crippled, multi-ton machine from the laws of physics, his combat training for flying damaged aircraft in hostile territory taking over completely. In the boardroom, the scene played out in stunning, terrifying clarity. The board members watched, mouths agape, as the panoramic view showed the helicopter being tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane. They saw the flashing red lights in the cockpit, the terrified faces of their potential partners. And they heard Cade's voice, a steady, authoritative presence in the heart of the storm. Preston stood frozen, his speech forgotten. The confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. The liability he had just spent 10 minutes methodically destroying was, at that very moment, saving the lives of the men who held the key to the merger. The ticking time bomb was the only thing keeping them from plummeting into Lake Michigan. "He's overriding the fly-by-wire system," one of the board members, a former Air Force general, whispered in awe. "He's flying it completely manually. My God, I haven't seen that kind of skill since Desert Storm." Blair didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Cade's actions were her closing argument. The live feed was her proof, a real-time high-stakes rebuttal that was more powerful than any speech she could ever give. Preston Davenport tried to ruin a good man out of pure spite and arrogance. If you're officially on Team Cade and Blair, hit that subscribe button now. Let's show the Prestons of the world that good people always win. As the board watched, mesmerized, Cade managed to wrestle the Valkyrie out of the worst of the storm, the helicopter now limping but stable back toward the city. The immediate danger had passed, neutralized not by Apex technology, but by the skill and courage of the one man her father had tried to erase. The general on the board turned his steely gaze away from the screen and looked directly at Preston. "You were saying something about a liability, Preston?" he asked, his voice laced with ice. Preston Davenport's face, once flushed with victory, was now the color of ash. He was utterly, publicly, and irrevocably defeated, not by his daughter's words, but by the very heroism he had sought to weaponize. The descent was a masterclass in controlled disaster. Cade brought the crippled Valkyrie in not with a gentle touch, but with a firm, authoritative command, forcing the damaged machine to obey his will. He bypassed the main helipad, opting for a controlled emergency landing on a closed-off service runway. The landing was hard, jarring, but safe. The moment the skids were firmly on the ground and the engine spooled down, a profound silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the ragged, relieved breaths of the Omnicorps executives. The ground crew, who had watched the entire ordeal on radar with their hearts in their throats, swarmed the helicopter. But before they could even get the doors open, Coleman, the Omnicorps CEO, was already unbuckling his harness. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing with an adrenaline-fueled clarity. He didn't wait for the stairs. He practically jumped to the tarmac and strode directly to the cockpit door as Cade was finishing the shutdown sequence. When Cade emerged, Coleman grabbed his hand, shaking it with a fierce, genuine gratitude. "Mr. Nolan," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "I've been in boardrooms my whole life, listening to people talk about risk mitigation and asset management. I've never seen it personified. That was the single greatest display of professionalism under pressure I have ever witnessed." He then turned to Blair, who had just arrived on the scene, her face a mixture of relief and pride. "Blair," Coleman continued, not missing a beat, "the merger is a go. The contract is signed. But I'm adding a clause. Omnicorps is creating a new executive flight division for our global operations. We want him to build it and run it." He gestured to Cade. "That is a non-negotiable term." It wasn't a business proposal, it was a coronation. Cade wasn't just a hero, he was now one of the most sought-after assets in the aviation industry. Back in the boardroom, the live feed had been replaced by the stony, silent face of Preston Davenport. The general who had identified Cade's skill was the first to speak. He made a motion. "I move for a formal and immediate censure of Preston Davenport for acting in bad faith and attempting to manipulate this board for personal reasons, and to strip him of his chairman emeritus status, effective immediately." Another board member seconded the motion without hesitation. "Furthermore," she added, her voice like ice, "I move for an official vote of absolute confidence in CEO Blair Davenport's leadership and a commendation for her exemplary judgment." There was no debate. The vote was unanimous. Preston didn't even get a chance to defend himself. His power had evaporated in the time it took for a helicopter to fall out of the sky and be saved. In less than 5 minutes, his legacy at the company he had built was systematically and surgically dismantled. He was a ghost, a name in the archives. Justice is served. The bully lost and the heroes won. Comment, victory, below if you loved seeing Preston Davenport get exactly what he deserved. Let's celebrate this win together. The meeting adjourned. The board members filed out, each stopping to offer Blair their quiet, respectful congratulations. Finally, only she and her father remained in the vast, silent room. He stood by the window looking down at the city that no longer felt like his. He looked smaller, older, the formidable patriarch diminished into just a man. He turned to face her, his expression not of anger but of a quiet, hollow bitterness. The fight was gone, replaced by the sour taste of defeat. He had calculated every angle, manipulated every piece on the board, but he had failed to account for the one variable that mattered: character. "I analyzed the asset and misjudged the man," he said, the words sounding like they were being scraped from the bottom of his soul. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something that wasn't pride or arrogance, but a simple, stark acknowledgement. He was the better man, Preston stated. It was a concession, a final, bitter admission that his world of status and power had been defeated by a quiet courage he could never comprehend. Blair listened, and the fury she had felt, the years of resentment, simply dissolved. She didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of release. She no longer needed to fight him, to prove him wrong, to earn his respect. She was already free. She gave him a single, final nod, an acknowledgement of his surrender and a quiet goodbye to the person she used to be. Then she turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his own making. A month later, the rooftop of the Apex Tower was no longer a place of ghosts. The biting Chicago wind that had once whipped smoke and fear across the helipad was now just a gentle, calming breeze. The city lights glittered below, no longer a distant abstraction to Blair, but a vibrant, living map of the place she now truly called home. She walked out onto the helipad, not in a severe power suit, but in a soft cashmere coat, her hair down, falling gently around her shoulders. Cade was waiting for her by the cockpit of the Valkyrie, which sat gleaming under the soft glow of the rooftop lights. He wasn't in uniform or a flight suit, just a simple dark jacket and jeans. He looked at peace, the deep-set lines of exhaustion around his eyes having finally softened. The invisible weight he had carried for so long was gone. He smiled as she approached, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Almost," Blair replied, her own smile mirroring his. "There's something I need to know first." Cade's expression turned serious, though not worried. He took her hands, his grip warm and steady. He didn't offer a grand, dramatic speech. That wasn't his way. His words were as calm and true as his piloting. "For years," he began, his gaze locked on hers, "flying was about the mission. Get in, get out, complete the objective. Then it became about escaping. Running from the past, running from the pain. When I flew you and Zoe off this roof, it was about survival." He paused, squeezing her hands gently. "But now, when I think about flying, I just think about a destination. Somewhere I want to go. And every time, the destination is wherever you are." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple box. Inside was not a large diamond, but a platinum band with a single elegant engraving on the inside, a pair of tiny, subtle wings. "I'm not asking you to be my co-pilot, Blair," he said, his voice quiet but full of a strength that resonated deep within her. "I'm asking you to be my true north, my horizon. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Blair's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound, serene joy. The walls around her heart hadn't just been dismantled. They had dissolved completely, leaving only a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Yes," she whispered. "Always yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. A small voice piped up from the doorway leading to the roof. "Does this mean we can go now? You promised we'd catch the sunrise." Zoe ran out onto the helipad, clutching her sketchbook, her face beaming with excitement. She was no longer the terrified child from the fire, but a bright, happy girl who knew she was safe. Cade laughed, scooping her up into a hug. "You got it, sweet pea. Captain's orders." The three of them walked to the helicopter together. This machine, once a symbol of terror and then a tool of corporate warfare, was now simply theirs. Cade took the pilot's seat, Blair settled in beside him as his true co-pilot, and Zoe buckled herself in the back, her sketchbook open to a new page, ready to draw what she saw. The engine hummed to life, a familiar, comforting sound. As the Valkyrie lifted off into the pre-dawn sky, the city sprawling beneath them like a promise, Blair looked at the family she had found in the heart of a fire. She glanced at Cade, who met her gaze with a look of pure love, his hand briefly leaving the controls to rest on hers. They were not fleeing danger or chasing a deal. They were flying toward the sunrise, a brilliant, hopeful line of gold and pink spreading across the vast, calm waters of Lake Michigan. They were flying toward their own horizon together.